GhastlyGarlic Episode 39. Ghost Festival, a Zhizha ghost story. Prologue. In the heart of Taiwan's rural landscape lies a small, remote village known as Qianxi. Time seems to have forgotten this place, where the old ways still hold sway and the boundaries between the living and the dead blur with unsettling ease. At the village's edge, where the last house meets the looming forest, an unremarkable shop has stood for as long as anyone can remember. This shop, run by a hunched old man named Shixian, specializes in the ancient craft of Zhizha, intricate paper effigies crafted to honor the deceased. Shixian is a man of few words, his back bent under the weight of time and perhaps something more. His shop is filled with lifelike paper figures, men, women, children, even animals, all meticulously crafted with an eerie attention to detail. Their eyes, however, remain unpainted, a tradition and a taboo among Zhizha craftsmen. It is said that a Zhizha figure, once given eyes, becomes a vessel for wandering spirits, especially those who have not found peace in the afterlife. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Shixian carefully brought his creations inside. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the rustle of unseen creatures in the shadows. Among the figures was a pair of paper dolls, a man and a woman, dressed in traditional red and green, their colors stark against the dim light. As Shixian reached for the door, a sudden thud echoed behind him. He turned sharply to see a woman in black lying on the ground, her clothes drenched, though the skies had been clear all day. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes blank and lifeless. A pungent odor of decay filled the air, seeping into every corner of the shop, and his large white cat, usually placid, let out a blood-curdling scream, fur bristling in fear. Shixian froze, his breath catching in his throat. The woman's feet hovered just above the ground, untouched by the earth beneath. A cold dread settled over him. This was no ordinary visitor. The woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, broke the silence. "Old man, I mean you no harm. I am not of this world, but I beg you, help me." Shixian, heart-pounding, managed to ask, "What do you need from me?" The woman, her thin fingers brushing aside strands of wet hair, spoke of a violent death, how she was brutally murdered and left in a ditch just outside the village. She was with child, a fact that made her tale all the more tragic. Her spirit, bound by unfinished business, could not move on. She pleaded with Shixian to retrieve her body and return it to her husband in the nearby village of Zhongsuan, so she and her unborn child might finally find peace. Moved by her plight, Shixian agreed, though his mind was clouded with doubt. This was not the first time he had encountered something from beyond the grave, but the woman's story tugged at his heart. He gathered his courage and prepared to follow her into the night. As they walked the deserted path toward the ditch, the woman leading the way, Shixian noticed the pungent scent of rot emanating from her, despite the fragrant sachet she carried. The road seemed endless, the shadows deepening with every step. Shixian tried to make small talk, asking about her life in Zhongsuan, but something in her responses set him on edge. Finally, they arrived at the ditch, a deep, dark crevice that seemed to swallow the light. The woman pointed down, her voice a whisper. "My body lies there." Shixian peered into the darkness, but the night was too thick to see anything clearly. He hesitated, suggesting they wait until dawn. The woman, her patience waning, insisted that he descend immediately. But as the first light of dawn began to creep into the sky, Shixian saw the faint glint of something in her eyes, something dark, malevolent. Without warning, Shixian pulled a charm from his pocket and slapped it onto the woman's forehead. A hiss of smoke rose from where the paper met her skin, and she recoiled, a look of pure hatred twisting her features. "You old fool. You think you can trick me?" She snarled, her voice no longer pleading but venomous. The woman was not who she claimed to be. She was a stench ghost, a malevolent spirit known for its overpowering stench and the ability to lure the living to their doom. Her belly, swollen with decay, was a grotesque mockery of pregnancy. Shixian had known from the start. The scent had betrayed her, and the white cat's reaction had confirmed his suspicions. With a final, anguished scream, the ghost was consumed by the light of dawn, her form disintegrating into a wisp of smoke that vanished into the morning air. Shixian stood alone at the edge of the ditch, the weight of what had almost been heavy on his shoulders. He knew this was not the end. Such spirits never rest easily. As he turned back towards the village, the first rays of sunlight touched the earth, but the chill in his bones remained. Chapter 1: The First Omen. Weeks passed since that harrowing night, yet the memory lingered like a shadow over Shixian's every waking moment. The villagers of Qianxi continued their daily lives, oblivious to the dangers lurking at the edge of their world. Shixian resumed his work in the Zhizha shop, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions, but his mind was elsewhere, haunted by the encounter. It wasn't long before strange things began to happen in the village. The first sign came when livestock started disappearing. At first, it was just a few chickens, then a goat, and finally, a cow vanishing without a trace. The villagers whispered of wolves or wild dogs, but Shixian knew better. The disappearances occurred on nights when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. Then came the dreams. Villagers reported waking in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, with the unmistakable feeling that something was watching them. Children spoke of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of their beds, a figure with hollow eyes and a stench that filled the room. Shixian knew the signs all too well. Whatever malevolent force he had encountered had not been vanquished. It had merely taken a different form. Shixian sought the counsel of Madame Yiling, an elderly woman known for her knowledge of the old ways. She lived alone in a small hut on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by herbs and talismans. Yiling was a fixture in Qianxi, respected and feared in equal measure for her ability to commune with the spirit world. When Shixian arrived, she was already waiting for him, her sharp eyes assessing him as he entered the dimly lit room. Without a word, she motioned for him to sit and began to brew a pot of tea, the aroma of bitter herbs filling the air. "You've stirred something, haven't you, Shixian?" she asked, her voice raspy with age. Shixian nodded, recounting the events of that night in detail. Yiling listened intently, her expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. "You were right to suspect her, but wrong to think that she would disappear so easily," Yiling said, finally breaking the silence. "Stench ghosts are persistent. They feed on fear, and once they latch onto a place, they are nearly impossible to rid of. You've dealt with one, but she's left a mark on this village." Shixian's heart sank. "What can I do?" Yiling reached for a small wooden box, opening it to reveal a set of ancient talismans, each inscribed with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "These are spirit wards, powerful enough to repel most malevolent entities. Place them around your shop, your home, and the places where the disappearances occurred. But be warned, these are only a temporary solution. The stench ghost will find a way around them eventually." Shixian took the talismans, feeling their weight in his hand. "What of the dreams? The figure that haunts the children?" Yiling hesitated, her expression grim. "That is a sign of something far worse than a stench ghost. There are ancient forces at play here, spirits that have been disturbed by what you did. The dreams are a warning something else is coming, something that thrives on fear and suffering." Shixian's grip tightened on the talismans. "How do I stop it?" Yiling shook her head. "I don't know if you can. But you must prepare. Gather the villagers, warn them, and protect them as best you can. The old ways may be the only thing standing between us and whatever darkness is coming." As Shixian left Yiling's hut, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the village. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though the skies remained clear. He could feel the weight of the talismans in his pocket, a small comfort against the growing unease that gnawed at him. That night, Shixian placed the talismans around his shop, his home, and the places where the livestock had disappeared. He worked in silence, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. As he finished, a low growl echoed from the forest, followed by a piercing scream that made his blood run cold. Shixian turned towards the sound, his heart pounding. The night was still, too still, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching him with hollow eyes. But when he blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the lingering stench of decay in the air. Chapter 2: The Vanishing. Despite the talismans and the warnings, the strange occurrences in Qianxi only grew worse. The villagers, once dismissive of Shixian's concerns, now lived in a state of constant fear. Livestock continued to vanish, but now, so did people. It started with the old and the weak, those who lived on the outskirts of the village, alone and forgotten. One by one, they disappeared without a trace, their homes left undisturbed, as if they had simply walked away in the middle of the night. The first to go was Old Man Chen, a recluse who lived in a crumbling shack near the forest's edge. He was known for his odd habits and foul temper, but even he had not deserved such a fate. His absence was discovered by a passing villager, who noticed his front door swinging open, the interior of the house eerily quiet. Inside, there was no sign of struggle, only the overwhelming stench of rot. Next was Auntie Mai, a kind-hearted woman, who had lost her husband years ago, and spent her days tending to her garden. She was last seen watering her plants in the evening, her gentle humming carried on the breeze. When a neighbor came to visit the next morning, she was gone, the garden tools lying where she had left them, the earth damp with water that had long since evaporated. The disappearances spread like a plague, each one more unsettling than the last. The villagers no longer ventured out after dark, locking their doors and windows as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Fear settled over Qianxi like a suffocating blanket, and the once tight-knit community began to unravel, each person too afraid to trust their neighbors. Shixian, for his part, became increasingly paranoid. He fortified his shop and home with every protection he could think of: talismans, charms, even salt scattered across the thresholds. But it was never enough. The sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing day, a constant pressure at the back of his mind. The dreams also intensified. Each night, he found himself wandering through a dark forest, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He could hear whispers in the wind, voices calling his name, pleading for help, but he could never see who they belonged to. And always, in the distance, he could see the flicker of a fire, a beacon of light that he could never reach. One night, as he tossed and turned in his bed, a loud knock at his door jolted him awake. The clock showed just past midnight, and the village was deathly silent. Shixian hesitated, his heart racing, before slowly making his way to the door. He peered through the peephole, but saw nothing, only the inky blackness of the night. Another knock, louder this time. Shixian's hand shook as he reached for the handle, a part of him screaming not to open it. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, compelled him to turn the knob. Standing on his doorstep was a young girl, no older than 10. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with dirt, and her eyes wide with terror. She clutched a tattered doll to her chest, its once bright colors faded and stained. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me." Shixian knelt to her level, trying to keep his voice calm. "What's wrong, child? Where are your parents?" The girl shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They are gone. The bad thing took them." A chill ran down Shixian's spine. "What bad thing?" She looked over her shoulder, into the darkness beyond. "The Shadow Man. He comes at night and takes people away. He took my mommy and daddy." Shixian's blood ran cold. The Shadow Man, the figure that had haunted his dreams, the one he had seen at the edge of the forest. It was real, and it was taking the villagers. He stood up, his mind racing. "Come inside, quickly." The girl hesitated, her eyes darting to the shadows. "He's watching. He always watches." Shixian grabbed her hand and pulled her inside, slamming the door shut behind them. He locked it, bolted it, and placed a talisman on the door for good measure. The girl stood in the middle of the room, her eyes wide with fear. "You're safe here," Shixian said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "I'll protect you." But the girl shook her head again, her voice a broken whisper. "He's here. He's always here." Shixian felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The room suddenly felt colder, the air heavy with the scent of decay. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. In the corner of the room, just beyond the flickering candlelight, stood a figure, a tall, thin man, his features obscured by shadow. His eyes, hollow and empty, seemed to bore into Shixian's soul. The girl screamed, a high-pitched wail that pierced the night. Shixian stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed the nearest talisman and hurled it at the figure, but it passed through him as if he were made of smoke. The Shadow Man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Shixian could feel his presence, a cold, suffocating pressure that threatened to crush him. Desperate, he reached for another talisman, this one larger and more ornate, and held it out in front of him. The Shadow Man paused, his hollow eyes narrowing. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without warning, the shadow man lunged, his form dissolving into a cloud of darkness that engulfed the room. Shixian screamed, his voice lost in the swirling blackness. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the girl's terrified face, her eyes wide with fear. And then, there was nothing. Chapter 3, The Haunting. When Shixian awoke, the sun was shining through the windows, and the room was filled with the sounds of the village coming to life. He sat up, his head pounding, and looked around in confusion. The girl was gone, as was the shadow man. The room was exactly as it had been before, with no sign of the chaos that had unfolded the night before. Had it all been a dream, a figment of his overactive imagination? But the fear, the darkness, it had felt so real. Shixian rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. He needed to speak to Madame Yiling again. She would know what to do. But when he arrived at her hut, he found the door ajar and the inside in disarray. Herbs and talismans were scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke. Madame Yiling was nowhere to be found. Shixian's heart raced as he searched the hut, calling her name. But there was no answer, only the empty silence of a place that had been abandoned in haste. He found her in the back room, slumped against the wall, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, and she gave him a weak smile. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Shixian knelt beside her, panic rising in his chest. What happened? Who did this? Yiling shook her head, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut deep. It wasn't who, but what. The shadow man, he's growing stronger. He's feeding off the fear in the village, and soon, he'll be unstoppable. Shixian clenched his fists, anger boiling inside him. There must be something we can do. Some way to stop him. Yiling reached into her robes and pulled out a small, ornate box. This is the only thing that might work. It's an ancient relic, passed down through generations. It holds the power to banish spirits, but it comes at a great cost. Shixian took the box, feeling its weight in his hands. What kind of cost? Yiling's eyes were full of sorrow. A life. The relic requires a life force to activate it. A sacrifice. Shixian's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. Whose life? Yiling placed a trembling hand on his arm. Yours, Shixian. Only the one who has disturbed the spirit can make the sacrifice. You must give your life to save the village. Shixian's breath caught in his throat. He had spent his entire life surrounded by death, crafting Zhizha for the dead, but he had never imagined that he would be the one to face it so directly. But what choice did he have? If he did nothing, the shadow man would consume the village, and everyone in it. He nodded, his decision made. Tell me what I need to do. Yiling's eyes filled with tears. You're a brave man, Shixian. I'm sorry it has to be this way. She explained the ritual in detail, how he must take the relic to the forest where the shadow man first appeared, how he must offer his own blood to activate its power, and how he must speak the ancient words that would bind the spirit forever. As she spoke, Shixian felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had always known that his life was tied to death, that his work with Zhizha had a deeper meaning. Perhaps this was his true purpose, to protect the living from the dead. When the ritual was complete, and the shadow man was finally banished, the village would be safe. But Shixian would not live to see it. He spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering the necessary materials and saying his goodbyes to the village he had called home for so long. He didn't tell anyone of his plan. There was no point in worrying them, no point in making them suffer any more than they already had. As night fell, Shixian made his way to the forest, the relic clutched tightly in his hand. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like the fingers of 1,000 spirits. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He reached the clearing where he had first seen the shadow man, the place where it had all begun. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the scene. Shixian took a deep breath and began the ritual. He drew a circle in the dirt, sprinkled it with salt, and placed the relic at its center. Then, with trembling hands, he cut his palm and let the blood drip onto the relic. The air crackled with energy as he spoke the ancient words, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. The shadows around him began to writhe, and the temperature dropped sharply. The shadow man appeared at the edge of the clearing, his hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Shixian continued the ritual, forcing the words out even as the pain in his chest grew unbearable. The relic began to glow, a brilliant light that cut through the darkness. The shadow man let out a terrible scream, a sound that echoed through the forest like the wail of 1,000 lost souls. He lunged at Shixian, but was stopped by the circle of salt, his form writhing and twisting as he struggled to break free. With the last of his strength, Shixian spoke the final words of the ritual. The relic exploded in a flash of light, and the shadow man was consumed by the brilliance, his form disintegrating into nothingness. Shixian collapsed to the ground, his vision fading. The last thing he saw was the moon, shining brightly in the sky, before everything went dark. Chapter 4, The Aftermath. When the villagers found Shixian's body the next morning, they were filled with a deep sadness, but also a sense of relief. The strange occurrences had ceased, and the village was once again at peace. They buried him at the edge of the forest, where he had sacrificed himself to save them all. For years to come, the villagers would speak of Shixian as a hero, a man who had given his life to protect them from the darkness. They placed offerings at his grave, Zhizha crafted in his likeness, and told his story to their children, so they would never forget the sacrifice he had made. But the forest remained a place of fear, a place where the shadows seemed to move on their own, and where the air was always cold, no matter the time of year. The villagers avoided it, believing that the shadow man's spirit still lingered there, trapped between worlds, waiting for another to disturb its rest. And in the dead of night, when the wind howled through the trees and the moon was hidden behind the clouds, some claimed they could hear a voice, a whisper in the darkness, calling their name, begging for help. But no one ever answered. Epilogue: The Forgotten. Years passed, and the village of Qianxi slowly faded from memory. The younger generations moved away, seeking new opportunities in the cities, and the once thriving community dwindled to a handful of elderly residents. The forest, once feared and respected, became overgrown and wild, its paths lost to time. The grave at its edge was forgotten, the offerings crumbled to dust, and the story of Shixian became just another ghost tale told around the fire. But the darkness remained, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone to find it once more. And when the time was right, when the moon was high and the wind whispered through the trees, the shadow man would return. For evil never truly dies, it only sleeps, waiting for the next foolish soul to wake it from its slumber. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.